Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen crazy stuff happen. But when people see truth and they feel it in their core, then, they may deny it a few times, but after a while, truth is truth. That's why they're saying live in your core of truth. So important.
Okay.
All right. So you got two, it's interesting, these two women in very different styles of life, but they were both very focused on what they needed to make their lives work.
Okay.
So that's,
Yeah.
yeah. And physically different in every way. Our Congo woman was like tall and lean and strong and just like laser focus. And very much an animal telepath without question, which is why she loved being out with the animals so much, because she could sort of become one with them and see the world from their perspective.
Nice.
But yeah, she called it like visiting. Yeah, and then she would return to herself and go. Yeah. And then Sophie, who she was petite and just like so adorable and so frivolous and so silly, but brilliant, brilliant. Set her parameters, set her boundaries, set her goals. And, she didn't know about the world outside of her few villages and castles and whatnot. But for the world that she knew that she had to make it happen for herself. She wasn't going to let anyone else dictate to her what her life would be. And since she was in a time where women were not supposed to be outspoken, she had to do it in all these little subtle ways. How exhausting for her. But she said she had great fun. And she loved to eat like sugared fruits. And she said there was so much delicious food in her life that she had to do a great deal of dancing. And she had a little pony she would ride. And she's showing that it was, she was allowed to ride side saddle, but mostly she had a little tiny carriage that she would go out riding in. And she said, you think that's not exercise, but it is, because you're on roads, boom, boom, boom. Let's see. Okay, we're jumping to New York City, 1912. And okay, it's falling. You were like a suffragette. Actually, oops, sorry. I thought I turned that off. I apologize. You did go to jail for, like with the other women when you were protesting and marching, and you were force fed and stuff like that. But so okay, now she's coming through. So you were interesting. You were your father was French, and your mother was like Malaysian. So that's interesting. And they married and they lived well together in France, but then he received a job opportunity in New York. And things were difficult for them because there was much less social acceptance in New York. Many people assumed that your mother was his mistress or his servant, or things like that. And so you grew up really being teased a great deal by the other children. So you said, I'm going to become a school teacher. I'm going to make sure I teach people how to be intelligent and not, all of that. A very loving home. And you spent first half of your childhood in France and the second half in New York. So you knew that there was a better way of being, but you also knew you had a better life in New York because your father was earning much more money and had a prevalent position. Um, and there was one time when you were 14, your family went back to France for a few months on holiday. And that was just like the best summer of your life because you could just relax and draw a breath. But then you returned to New York and you felt immediately bruised by the words of teenagers can be so cruel. So you became a school teacher, and she's showing long, long hair that would pile up on the top of your head and then put a little straw hat on top of it with a ribbon around the what is it, the cup of that part of the hat, and a button-up outfit and a little reticule bag, and little lace-up shoes. And you so you became a school teacher, but then you started standing up for women's rights because you believed that if women had rights, then also non-whites would get more recognition and rights. And you felt debased and abused on all sides. Your brothers had an easier time than you had. And they kept saying to you, why don't you just get married? Then things will be easier. And you said, why? So people will call me a whore, like they call our mother. And, you would have these long, deep intellectual conversations about human dignity and the Bible versus the politics of other countries. You were passionate about what was going on in Russia, and then the communist revolution was starting, and many American intellectuals were going over there, or taking on the communist banner, which of course is not like the way the communists ended up. The original communism was very idealistic and similar to the American democracy of each person has the right to their own, identity and their own say of life. You're very idealistic, and you went to art salons, poetry readings. You yourself loved writing and painting, and you had many idealist artist friends. You spent a lot of time in Greenwich Village and Gramercy Park, and so then you were, guess it was around just before the U.S. went into World War One, or around that time, and there was a bunch of the men were all going to war, the women were expected to pick up the slack at home, but they were still being treated like second-class citizens. That's when he started marching in protests. And you started writing articles, letters of your ordeal, and you sent them to newspapers, and there was a newspaper that started printing your articles. And you lost your job as a teacher in disgrace because you were arrested for this. But you gained a job as you were writing letters to this newspaper, and they were setting money aside for you. And then when you got out of jail, you were there for 3 months. Yeah. And she said, no prison, no asylum is worse than the way we were treated just because we asked to be looked upon as humans. And you got a job as a newspaper reporter. she says, this is the important thing. It wasn't like the top newspaper, but she said at that time there were a lot of newspapers because like the artists didn't want to read the main paper. Like every different group had their own kind of paper. I didn't know that. That's interesting. And you were paid, and she said most importantly, you got to have your name on your byline. In those days, often the women would go and do the investigative reporting and write the article, and then men who were just sitting around the office smoking cigars would do minor editing, put their name on the byline. But you had your own byline because this was a woman's voice in a modern world.
Yeah.
That's what they said, your name, a woman's voice in a modern world. And she was married several times. So you married a poet who you're like, oh my God, alcohol, heroin, wanting women, stealing all my money. It was a relief when he overdosed. but but he wrote beautiful poems, most of which were unfinished. So you finished all of his poetry and published it in his name, edited by your name. And he had a reputation. You know, she said, imagine like Jim Morrison of the Doors, who started out great, and then no one talks about his later concerts where he was just like throwing up on stage. Yes. That your husband had a local reputation. So between his name and your name as the editor, the books actually sold. And you said in a way you kind of earned back everything he had taken from you, so that worked out. And then your second marriage was to a widowed newspaper editor who then later moved to magazines. And your relationship with him ensured that no matter what happened in the world, you would always have work. But you said also he was a good man, he was a kindly man. And for whatever reason, you weren't able to have children in that life, but he brought you 3 children that needed a mother. And you said best of all, they were all out of their nappies, but they came with the nannies.
Sounds great.
Oh my God, she's a hoot. So that's so interesting. You said you became frustrated because as you went on with your writing, you saw the way women were treated never really got better. That yes, we got the vote, but many women didn't use it, or they just voted how their husbands told them to. And during World War I, you wrote a lot of articles about idealism, suffragism, about what is the world fighting for, and then when the men came back, they wanted you to write articles more about like how to have a productive garden and chickens in your backyard and stuff like that. And then World War II hit and you had to write articles about how a woman can go to work and then come home and take care of everything. And then after World War II, you were forced to like a woman's garden kind of parties and recipes, and you just got disgusted with it all. And so you quit. Like you said, by then you're old, you should have quit anyway. You just loved writing. And so she said she lived a long life. It was a good life. But you attended marches and protests your whole life. And you were a suffragette to your grave.
That's great.
Yes. Yeah. She said, while it may have been difficult for a woman to be true to her voice, she said it was ironic that when you first started writing, it was your voice of speaking out, that they wanted. But then once you had a voice and you had a known name, she's not giving me her name though. She's like, they relegated you to bland stuff. But you said you never stopped making speeches and standing up and protesting.
Wow.
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. And so she's with you now because she said many of your struggles are comparable to hers. And also, we were just saying about you and your relationship with your husband. She said, you see how she made her life work, where she managed to, like, okay, so I got to write an article about recipes. Well, I'm writing an article and I enjoy it. But then I'm going to this protest march over here and I'm speaking at that rally over there. But I still come home and love my husband and my children and their nannies that I refuse to fire. And when her husband said, well, do we need so many servants? She said, well, sweetheart, if we didn't have so many servants, how could I go to so many rallies? So she wants to meet with you during, like, she wants you to meet with her during meditation, imagine her life. She said, watch movies or shows or read books about women of her time, of the suffragette movement, because that will really light a fire in you. That will be very pleasing to you. And yeah, she says everyone knows about Susan B. Anthony, but she had many peers. She was not even the most famous or outspoken of her time. She's just the only one who people remember. And she says the song Union Maid by Peggy Seeger should be your anthem.
I like it.
Yeah. You'll find yourself humming it when you're doing things. But she would like to advise you, because she was able to always be true to herself, even though she had to adapt to the ebbs and flows of life. And comes Jackie. And yeah, she feels there's much commonality between what you're going through at this exact time in your life to what her whole life was about. So she says when you're meditating, you can bring her in, or when you're going to sleep at night. Both she and your African gal. She said if you start imagining, daydreaming, slipping into dream state, then it's easy for them to come into your dreams. And if you wish advice from the two of them at once, Sophie's like, don't forget about me. You can go into a meditation where you go to a safe place, where you can have like a sacred fire and invite them to come and sit with you. All three of them and whoever else wants to come forward and have a conversation. Yeah. Yeah, that would be good. So a sacred fire can be like in a cave, or like on a mountaintop, or I've even done it in the living room with a fireplace going. Any place where and it can switch around. It doesn't have to be the same place every time. Any place where you find yourself naturally going to, let that be your sacred space for the moment. Yeah.
I'll do that.
Yeah. They would like to come forward and give you the support that you deserve to have.
Yes. That's great.
Yeah. Now, do you have any additional questions?